I learned over time that basically like the sort of the DOGE agenda has like three three legs to the stool. One is cutting contracts. Two is helping with the reduction in force. And then three is shipping software. So actually and they're all kind of related because I think without shipping software, it's hard to cut a lot of contracts. It's hard to like reduce the force. But unfortunately, a lot of the DOGE sort of like the bandwidth, and I think the stuff that Trump was okay with them focusing their time on was more on the first two. So I didn't end up doing as much software. I kind of just went kind of like on my own and was like, hey, VA people, like, can I work on stuff? And I kind of got like shown a bunch of different software projects they were working on. And I saw this one VA GPT thing they were building. I saw this VA chatbot, stuff that was like kind of aligned with what I was already doing and what I had a lot of experience with. And then I just started working on those projects as just like basically a pro bono software engineer.
Hey everyone, welcome to the Founders in Arms podcast with me, Imad Akan, co-founder and CEO of Mercury.
And I'm Raj Suri, co-founder of Lima and Tribe. And today we have with us Sahil Lavingia, founder and CEO of Gumroad. Sahil, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
You and I met at a Pinterest event, probably around 2011, 2012, maybe that type of zip code. You were one of the first employees of Pinterest, I think, at the time. And you were like a high school dropout or like a college dropout? You were really young, I remember.
Yeah, I was a college dropout. I dropped out of USC and moved up to the Bay Area. I was like, I think probably 19 at the time, and joined Pinterest as employee number 2 working on the iPhone app.
And you've had a really interesting journey since then, so we'll love to dive into that. But I wanted to first ask you that question because I remember it was remarkable to me meeting you. I was like, wow, this guy dropped out of college to join a startup, at a very young age. And it was still rare then. It's happening, and then it became even more rare after that, and now it's happening again. So it's kind of gone through the cycle. Tell me a little bit about that decision. How did you get into startups in the first place?
Yeah, I mean, I always felt like I wanted to build stuff. I learned to code and do some like web design, graphic design when I was in like high school, and it was still like I think early enough where I didn't know if this was like a real career path, and so my inclination was to go get a CS degree and then work at Google. That was like the dream job at the time. Everyone wanted to like work at Google if you were a software engineer. That was like the bean bags and ping pong tables and all that kind of stuff. And so yeah, my sort of plan, I guess, was to go to college, graduate, go to Google, learn what goes into building, a high scale website, and then eventually like work my way down to like working at smaller and smaller companies and eventually like starting my own thing. And when I got to USC, I was in California. I was like so much closer to Silicon Valley. I went to startup school, Y Combinator startup school at Stanford, and posted things I'd built on Hacker News. It's kind of funny how some things like haven't changed at all. Like I sort of recommend this path for even today, 15 years later. And so, I would post my stuff on Hacker News, and it turns out there was like this massive talent sort of war going on where like, if you're Pinterest, for example, it's hard to compete with Google and Facebook and these big companies, paying decent comp, hiring like the top tier talent, all the new grads. And so as a sort of freshman in college, I started getting emails from all sorts of different founders being like, hey, do you want to work for, Mixpanel or Pinterest or Reddit, maybe Hitmonk, something like that, like a bunch of these kinds of companies, and like a lot of the YC sort of adjacent companies back in the day. And I basically was like, well, this is kind of like it's a lot of steps to like work at a startup. If I can just skip all of those steps, and just go straight to like sort of like the penultimate step of being a founder, why not? And also college is expensive. Pinterest is paying me money. So like the math was like, this is kind of like a really great opportunity. I think in hindsight, I think now that I'm like a little bit older, I have some gray hair, like I think I'm a little bit more moderated about like that decision than I used to be. Like when I was a kid, I was like, this is obviously what I should be doing. I did, I think, lose out on some sort of like social interactions and like building a network at college, and like there would have been probably some utility to that. Like the older you get, I see sort of like a lot of these alumni networks matter a lot for certain people. But it was just like, yeah, this like accelerated pace of learning, and it felt like a moment in time that like if I didn't join, like this was like this unique moment with like the iPhone, the App Store, all these mobile apps going from 0 to 1, that if I had like waited 2 more years or 3 or 4, etc., like to your point, like it kind of like phased out a little bit. And now we're getting back into this resurgence of like AI and craziness in San Francisco again. So I think in that sense, it was probably the right call.
How quickly did you go from kind of Pinterest to starting your first startup? And you went, your first startup was Gumroad, right?
Correct. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, pretty fast. I joined Pinterest in like January and I started Gumroad in September. So I kind
Oh,
of went.
really? Okay. You were really accelerated.
I know. Yeah. It was a bit too fast, to be honest. We raised our Series A like February of the next year. So I went from kind of like being a high school student to like having a Series A from Kleiner in, about like 18 months or something like that. 2 years.
Why'd you say it was too
but,
fast? Was there things that you kind of regret in terms of like mistakes you made or something like that, or just like
I just think that I
experiences?
never really I was like so focused on the future and just focused on like trying to like, kind of like hit this crazy personal month over month growth for myself that I never really, I think if I had spent more time at Pinterest, one, I would have invested some stock. That would have been nice. But I probably would have just like had more experience and gone into Gumroad with like a little bit more of a network and of like a point of view on how to build things properly and what are the right or wrong things. I mean, it ended up working out, so I have no regrets. But I was kind of on this accelerated path that I was just really trying to like get to the next milestone. And in Silicon Valley, there's a lot of this now vibe coding, bootstrapping type stuff on Twitter. I think the nice thing about VC and sort of this quote unquote traditional approach is that there's like such a clear path to defined of like what you're supposed to kind of be doing and like what success sort of is supposed to look like, which kind of just made it kind of like college in that sense when you're like, oh, I'm supposed to be doing this and then I'm supposed to be raising our, do YC, and then I do demo day, and then I do seed round, and then I do or pre-seed, seed, A, that sort of thing. And so yeah, I was just kind of like trying to kind of like get through the hurdles as quickly as I could.
I remember in my early 20s, like 6 months felt like a long time. Like I remember going like, wow, like I just got to do this so quickly. And now that I'm like 40, I'm like, wow, 6 months is like a breeze. I don't even know what happened in 2025. It's just gone.
Imad, do you hire people like dropouts out of college? I'm curious if what's your philosophy on hiring folks and funding founders, who are that young.
So in terms of funding founders, I mean, I don't really ask like what's your age. I guess sometimes we will say we dropped out. It is, I would say, still a rare thing that it's a college dropout, an early college dropout, like doing it in your last year, which is like, in my opinion, basically the same as like graduating. So I think it's actually rare, but I wouldn't say I discern. I think one thing which is probably part of a longer conversation is that junior engineers, like it's actually kind of hard to hire them now with AI and things like that. Like I think I guess maybe it's bifurcated, but like generally speaking, I feel like senior engineers are like more valuable now that like you can quite quickly do like basic code, and like this more advanced stuff is more valuable, and more senior engineers can be more 10x engineers, if that makes sense. There is probably a bifurcation where there's some just like really good junior engineers that are like very deep in AI and can like show that they're like extremely productive. But I do feel like the current job market is like much, much harder for junior engineers than it used to be like 5 years ago even. I don't know what you think, so.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, I think it's a super interesting phenomenon that like effectively coding agents, the sort of the 10x engineer is often like a result of having nothing else to do, right? And just being so focused on learning a specific kind of skill set and spending your nights and weekends like getting really into it, contributing to open source, like staying up to date on like whatever is happening and being the first to learn this thing and apply it. And nowadays I find that, yeah, if you have like what I really care about these days is hiring people who've seen a lot of stuff and have a lot of experience, not necessarily people who are willing to work nights and weekends, because you can now kind of queue up a bunch of background agents, via Cursor or Devin, Cloud Code, Codex. Like there's like several options now. That's something that happened in 2025, and the bottleneck is basically not code monkeying, like not actually typing the code, testing the code, making sure it works. It's, it's like actually understanding like what tools even exist. Like what like software architecture should we be using? Where should the data live? How should we, should we go single tenant, multi-tenant? And that I think comes with just a lot of trial and error, a lot of trying things and seeing how things have evolved. So, and to be honest, like a lot of sort of these college dropout type personalities, just like me at Pinterest, like they don't make great employees. Like they make great employees for like a short amount of time. They make great interns, but at the end of the day, like they clearly want to go do their own thing, right? And so you're kind of this stepping stone to them going out and doing their own thing. And their priorities are not necessarily going to be aligned with like writing the best possible code that's going to scale, and be super performant. It's going to be like just shipping feature, learning as much as possible, and then like building relationships and then starting a company, right? And so I'm open to it, but it's rare.
You mentioned a bunch of tools there. It seems, at least from your ex post, that you're like very into them and you get a lot of value out of them, as in you get a lot of productivity from your engineering. Is there one tool that you're like, hey, this is it? Is it Cursor, or is it like try everything and use everything?
I mean, it's crazy how fast things change. It's kind of like models, where like my default coding model was like first, I started writing code with AI only as recently as like not even a year ago, with Claude 3.5 Sonnet and Cursor, that came out about June of 2024. So I guess July 2024, almost been a year. Then that was kind of my daily driver for a long time. And then I started using Devin, and Devin was awesome because I could basically be on Slack on my phone, and be like, hey, fix this bug on the homepage, or like update this, help center document to include this new feature. And it was kind of this like asynchronous model of communication, which I really liked. And so that's kind of, and then my coding model changed. We switched to Gemini 2.5 Max, Pro Max, which is awesome. Now Claude 4 Opus and Sonnet are there. So I don't really, O3 apparently is really good too. I haven't tried Codex yet. I've heard really good things about Codex. I've heard really good things about Claude Code. I just started trying it out today, actually. But generally, I find that I'm either using Cursor, like if I'm in front of my laptop and I'm the one shipping the code, I'm using Cursor, agent mode. And if I'm not at my laptop, I'm using Devin via Slack. And that's kind of like my paradigm. I think eventually Devin will kind of, personally, I mean, I am really interested in this idea of like, as coding agents get better, like, do you even need an IDE? Like, why are you staring at the code? Like, what's the benefit of staring at a bunch of code that you didn't write, don't want to read?
I mean, tell me like the success rate of like Devin. Like you tell it on Slack, like, hey, go fix this thing. Is it like 95% it fixes it? Like 80% it fixes it? Like how much back and forth is it afterwards? Like, do you do a code review and then tell it like, this bit's wrong, or like go fix it yourself?
I think it depends on what you're building, but I think there's like this bell curve of stuff that it's like of complexity, and there's stuff that it's sort of like, you can definitely do the stuff on the left, like the stuff that's like really easy, and one line fixes, typos, things that aren't really like sort of conditional business logic changes.
Yep.
It can do stuff that like a lot of like API type changes too, because you can like run the tests and see those, like the JSON object is changed in this way. It can do a lot of front end stuff too. That's like, add a checkbox, and when the person gets the checkbox, pass this thing to the back end. But I think the architecture piece, where a lot of features end up being like this, where like a single feature you're building requires like a migration, a schema change, this like multi-step planning that is, front end, back end, API docs, help center doc changes, like a big feature update like that, it's not going to be able to do. But if you're willing, and this is kind of how I think about what the job is now, is that if you're willing to break it up into a bunch of atomic steps, like that's ends up becoming like what I hire people to do. And then at that point, you can kind of farm out the tasks and say, hey, Devin, update the API in this way. Hey, Devin, update the front end in this way. And Cursor now also has like background agents. So Cursor is going to start, going, and apparently they have a Slack integration now too. So, I do think this will become like the premier way of shipping code, that like you will have like a chat interface with an agent, and that agent will write the code for you, test the code for you, run the code in a,
And it's kind of interesting. You're saying like, for now, the most important skill is being able to break down your problem into like tiny pieces that like it has a high accuracy in like being able to do. And I guess like the size of the pieces will get bigger as it gets more.
I would say there's fundamentally like two skills. I think one is breaking things down into their smaller components. Like, for example, it's like, hey, I want like a green screen algorithm, right? Like, okay, like what is that actually, like how do you do that? You have to like iterate through all the pixels on the screen, you know, you like there's some like data structures and algorithms type thinking there that's required. But then the other side, I think, is knowing what tools even exist. And I think this is like a lot of where I find that I still have to kind of help people figure out what to do, because they'll like do the right thing, but they'll like not realize that like a sword exists, you know, like they'll do it by hand and they won't realize that there's actually like a really great open source project that solved this problem really well. And so I think that is also that is really hard to know what you don't know. And so, you know, if you're asked to solve like a problem and you don't know FFmpeg exists, you know, you're going to spend a lot of time. And so I think research, basically, I think research and product management, I think those are like the two fundamental skills, like software architecture, product management, and research, which ironically are kind of like the sort of like this like PM jobs that like people like to make fun of PMs for not being really that valuable. But actually, I think in this new world, effectively that becomes like the most valuable stuff, which ironically requires like a lot of meetings, a lot of like sitting by yourself, like doing research. The coding aspect and even the design aspect, if you think even about what design often is, right? It's just like looking at how other people have solved this problem in a bunch of different ways and then like sort of like transmuting into like what makes sense for your context. It's not like going to a museum and like, you know, like painting or like, you know, crazy graphics type stuff anymore.
On the design piece, I think there is an element of the both, right? You have to understand what context you're operating in. I think you also need to think about like if you want to reinvent something, then you have to understand things outside the current context, and then bring, you know, you want to maybe bring some of those ideas into what you're currently building. And so there could be there's an idea of like, okay, yeah, what have other people done? But there's also like, what should this be? And what should this be could actually come from some other thing. So I do think designers are still very valuable in this age, because the new, you know, AI is not going to necessarily come up with the brand new ideas that can sometimes change the game. But I have one question for you on the code stuff, which is like, how do you interview engineers then in this new age? Because we've done a bunch of interviews at Tribe, and you know, everyone's using AI now, obviously, which they should. But then, how do you evaluate, like, you know, the best engineers?
Yeah, it's hard. I mean, honestly, I think the conversation is like a lot more casual. You know, it's more about like talking to them about just trying to understand like how they spend their time and what they think about, and how they would solve a problem, not necessarily solving the problem, but like, you know, if you're asked to do something, you know, like at Gumroad, for example, we would often ask like, what, like, you know, in the beginning, the way I built Gumroad was every user had a balance like on their database, like in their row, right? So like if you made money, the balance went up. If you got paid out, the balance went down, which is like, you know, any accountant would like have an aneurysm. Like if that's like, what about logging? Like, how do you know double entry? Like all this kind of stuff. So how would you design a system that would like basically allow for like, for example, like you get paid, but then you issue a refund, and how do you map this over, you know, multiple months? And how do you know, what, you know, what would be the right approach to that? And not necessarily like the answer has to be correct. Cause I do think at this point, like if you kind of feed that into like an AI, like it'll do a decent job, frankly, of doing that. You know, if you give that to O1 Pro or like O3 and it does research and web search turned on, like it'll do a really good job. But I think listening to like having them do it extemporaneously and having them like walk, kind of like the chain of thought part of the AI, right? Like having them walk through like where does their instinct take them? Like, oh yeah, like, oh, I have this experience where we did this. That's not exactly the same, but it does have this like similar element to the problem where you need logging, you know, like security logs, or, you know, something like this, like a HIPAA or SOC 2 compliance or something. And maybe there's like, and just trying to get a sense of like, how interesting is this, like, has this person's life been, you know, like what life experience do they have? And just how generally intelligent they are. Because I think AI is really good at like helping you on a specific domain, but not necessarily giving you the high level like interpersonal skills and like the high level problem solving and business skills. So yeah, a lot of it is like, okay, I know you're a good engineer, or you can be if you're given these tools, but like, what have you built? What have you struggled with? I know Elon, for example, he asks like, what's the hardest problem you've worked on? Like, walk me through that, you know? The other one is, like just explain your career, like explain your decisions, like what leads you to this specific opportunity. Because I think that's a huge one, frankly. It's just like, it doesn't matter how good you are, but like, what is your alignment with the problem that we're trying to solve? If you spent like 15 years helping creators make money on the internet, then you're probably like a pretty good fit for what we're trying to do. If you're just optimizing for like total compensation, like we're probably not the right fit for you.
Maybe it's a good fork to talk about Department of Government Efficiency. So, you were a software engineer there for a bit. Like, tell us about like how you got into it. I only found out like 6-ish months ago that like random Silicon Valley people were kind of going to DOGE, which I thought was kind of cool. How did you kind of join it, and then I guess tell us like what you worked on and what the experience was like.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, so I joined in March. I started talking to them in December, mostly because I was a software engineer. I was working for VA, the Department of Veterans Affairs, which I learned is like the largest civilian agency in America. It's like the budget is $350 billion a year. It's a huge agency. It's number 2 to Department of Defense, basically, in terms of scale. And yeah, so I got connected through a friend of a friend. This is kind of how life often works. I did apply through the traditional recruiting means, but I didn't really hear back. So I had dinner with somebody who mentioned he knew someone working at DOGE, and I was like, oh, that sounds awesome. I would love to do that and see if I can like have an impact.
But you're operating a company at the same time, right? So like you're founder CEO of a company. How does that? It's like, Imad, are you gonna apply for DOGE? Like, so how did you decide to do
Maybe
that,
he's
I guess?
announcing that soon. Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's a good fit for certain founders. I mean, I would not recommend like, if my portfolio company founders were like, hey, by the way, I'm going to go join DOGE. We're like, what are you doing, man? Like, you got a company to run.
Yeah.
But I do think like, Gumroad is just like this weird, unique company where I started it. One, it's super old now. I've been doing it for like 14 years. It's profitable. It's been profitable for several years now. It's sort of like not on the venture capital train anymore. It just profitable, issues dividends. I still own like the majority of the company. And so, I've sort of like solved all the firefighting. There's no firefighting going on. Like we're shipping features. There's still stuff that we're doing, building features for creators, but it's not the most sort of like on the ground creative startup, basically. It's not really a startup, I guess, anymore, it's just like a boring technology company. We help creators make $150 million a year. It's been roughly flat for like 2 or 3 years now. So it just felt like and it was a temporary thing. Well, I wasn't going to go join and like leave that behind completely. But if I could do this for like, my plan was for 60 days to go and join
60
DOGE
days, okay.
and sort of have this like asymptotic learning curve where I could like learn a lot very quickly and hopefully have an impact very quickly.
Just like your
and then
Pinterest
eventually
days,
come
right?
back.
It's
Yeah, I guess. Yeah, exactly. And I had a newborn. The due date was May
Why only
22nd,
60
so.
days? That seems like can you really have an impact and learn a system and like implement something in such a short time?
I mean, I think so. I mean, I think that at least if the promise of DOGE is met, that it is like there's a lack of a certain kind of skill set and knowledge that if you introduce it into the system, you would be able to make at least sort of an inflection point where like the work would need to continue, but you could have some sort of like non-zero amount of impact in a relatively short amount of time. And the 60 days thing was me basically being like, it was already starting to get pretty late, and I had a newborn coming, my firstborn, that with the due date of May 22nd. So I just told them like, look, I can only really do this. Like once I have a kid, like life is different. I'm not going to be able to like leave everything behind and like go join a startup for, 24/7, that sort of thing. At least not for a while. So I can really commit. This is kind of my like last chance at doing something like this for 60 days. And I'll move to DC and I'll just work, all the time. There's nothing else to do really. And so, yeah, that's kind of like the concern. And honestly, I think I did get a lot done. Like I joined VA. There was like a sort of a series of quick signal chats where I talked to like, 2 or 3 different people, up to Stephen Davis, who kind of like ran DOGE for a while. I think he's now out as part of the whole 130-day limit thing. I don't know. I don't really keep in touch too much with them. They're pretty locked down. And then they said, hey, we have a spot for you at VA. You'll be the first software engineer at VA. You'll help us do like the DOGE agenda at VA. I was like, cool, that sounds awesome. And then I just showed up, March 17th, and got my laptop and at that point, had no real clue even really what Doge was going to do or what the mission was, besides like the stuff you read on Twitter, where you don't really know like what's real, what's not real, like what's propaganda, what's media bias, etc. So I was like, I'm just going to go and learn, resolve my FOMO, and hopefully have an impact. Like hopefully like use Cursor, and like ship a bunch
So
of
how
stuff
many
and
software
teach people.
engineers showed up at VA?
I was the only one.
You were the only one?
Yeah.
For the whole 60
Yeah, I was
days?
the only one. I was the only one. I mean, there's some VA employees, right, that are software engineers. Maybe 100 or so out of the VA. By the way, has 473,000 employees, so it's a huge organization. It's massively, yeah, it's huge.
So you show up and then what?
Yeah, then the one Doge person who was already there, who's was kind of more of like a business mind, was like, we need your help. I was like, awesome. What do you want me to do? And they're like, okay, this is what we're working on. We're like reviewing the VA's contracts. We have 90,000 contracts we're reviewing. I was like, that's a lot. He's like, yeah, we're basically just like reviewing them manually right now. I'm like, okay, well, we should probably use like AI to do this. Like to at least a first pass, you could use AI. And so that was like one of the first things I did was like basically write a script that I published actually on GitHub that anyone can read and feedback. And some people every once in a while tell me like I'm evil for publishing it. It's great. But I basically just wrote this script that's like a pretty simple, like, this is kind of a good example of like, I think even if you're a really good engineer, like, and you're very smart, if you don't understand what tools exist, you may not come up with this kind of this piece of software, which is not very complicated on its face. Basically, it just plugs into OpenAI's API, and VA has like an internal to VA version of GPT-4o, and so we use that, and just basically loops through every single PDF in the system, which I had to get access to, and basically extracts the text and then runs it through an LLM that says, hey, this is the kind of contracts that we're looking to cut in this sort of way. Should we cut it or not? And it would return, basically this big CSV of like, about 10% of the contracts we should sort of potentially terminate. And so it's kind of just like helping, I learned over time that basically like the sort of the Doge agenda has like three legs to the stool. One is cutting contracts. Two is helping with the reduction in force. And then three is shipping software. So actually like, and they're all kind of related, because I think without shipping software, it's hard to cut a lot of contracts. It's hard to like reduce the force. But unfortunately, a lot of the Doge sort of like the bandwidth, and I think the stuff that Trump was okay with them focusing their time on was more on the first two. So I didn't end up doing as much software. I kind of just went kind of like on my own and was like, hey, VA people, like, can I work on stuff? And I kind of got like shown a bunch of different software projects they were working on. And I saw this one VA GPT thing they were building. I saw this VA chatbot, stuff that was like kind of aligned with what I was already doing, and what I had a lot of experience with. And then I just started working on those projects as just like basically a pro bono software engineer.
When you were looking at a contract, like how do you decide it's like cuttable? Is it just it's very expensive? Is it like hardly anyone's getting utility out of it? Like what are the metrics that you're looking for to decide? If
Yeah, I
it's a
mean,
waste?
unfortunately, like you don't have a lot outside of the, we're kind of coming into the system with like not a lot of context, right? So to Raj's point, like, it's helpful to know like how other people have done, or like what's happening outside of the exact context that you're in, right? And in this case, we have like these PDFs, which have a lot of information about the contract itself, how much money it is, like what it's for, the different line items, but we don't, the vendor, et cetera, but we don't have like what is the utility of this? You then have to like go find some other data set that says like, okay, this is like the result of this contract, and like what is the value? And it never really, you could ask the contracting officer for justification. So often that would be the next step. But for in the beginning, we were just kind of doing it topical, right? We were basically saying, what are the kinds of contracts we don't want to renew, that we want to terminate? Basically things that don't affect veterans. So if there's a bunch of contracts that are kind of like internal support, kind of like social media posting, recruiting services, video production, we would kind of sort of like come up with this script. And the way I would do it is I would basically like do my own best attempt with like the Doge person who was already in the room. We'd run it on like 10 or 20 contracts, and then we would kind of like disagree or agree with the results, and we would edit the prompt, and we'd kind of just keep doing that at larger and larger amounts, different contracts. We brought in some VA career people to kind of like, see like, do you guys agree with this kind of stuff? because effectively at the end of the day, like AI, I think is like it's just like replicating what human judgment would have done, right? Like if you have a really good prompt, it's just kind of doing what the 300 contracting officers would have taken like 6 months to do because there's just so many contracts, and just like saving them 80% of the time. Like it's not full self-driving, right? It's not going to do all the work for them, but it can like at least take one of their tasks and automate it. And so, yeah, we kind of just iterated on it, and we had like we ended up with like 300 lines of English that I later asked Elon. I was like, hey, can I open source this? Such that, in my opinion, people may disagree and agree with the sort of the DOGE approach. Maybe it's too aggressive on certain things, etc. But if we publish these, like, let's say every agency has like a similar 300 line prompt, that's a kind of a first pass of this like cutting contract process. Wouldn't that be good for like the average person to just see and know about, right? Like just publish it on GitHub and say, this is the prompt, like help us improve it, show it to career employees. Unfortunately, I think DOGE kind of took a little bit more, and he was cool with that, so I did. But I think DOGE ended up taking it wasn't enough, I think, in my opinion, at VA at least, like it wasn't like working with the organization as much as it was like kind of coming in. It was got more like a little bit more like a hostile takeover, versus like, like let us, we have some skills that you guys don't really have, and we're willing to work a lot longer than you may, as like you've been doing this job for 20 years, working, roughly 9 to 5. Let us help you do what you want to do. And it was a little bit more like, you guys are not aggressive enough. You guys are not cutting contracts that you should be cutting. So we're going to tell you which contracts to cut. And if you don't cut them, there's nothing we can really do except kind of like, try to like tag someone in at like a higher level of leadership, using our DOGE aura to be like, hey, look, like Trump said this, but like, Doug Collins said this, but this, the contracting officers don't really seem to want to do this. And that was kind of a lot of what the effort was spent on. A ton of it was, and this was more valuable, was me sitting in on a lot of IT spend meetings. They're called FITARA reviews, but this was like a law that was passed relatively recently that basically meant that the CIO of each agency gets to approve every IT contract. All IT spend has to go through the CIO. And so the CIO was like, hey, Sahil, you can like sit in on any meeting you want related to IT spend. And and most of the time maybe all the time, I was like basically the only software engineer in the room. So like you can imagine the VA has, let's say, like, I think it's about $8 billion of IT contracts, with IBM, Booz, Deloitte, all these Accenture, et cetera, like all these people, basically almost all the software that the federal government ships, like any software that you use to pay taxes, to do whatever, is an outsourced service generally. Like the government,
Some of the
really
best software engineering companies in the world, right? Deloitte.
IBM.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, exactly. Deloitte, right? Deloitte. I used to think Deloitte was like a toothpaste brand. I was like, well, Deloitte. What are they doing? It's like, wait, they're a software company. Like that's what they do. That's what IBM does. Like that's what Accenture does. Like people always
It
joke
sounds
that
like a
these guys
shaving
just make
company, right? It's
presentations
like,
all. Yeah, exactly.
razor company. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. It sounds like exactly.
I guess how much money, how many contracts did you end up canceling? I don't know if it's public, but how much money did you save? And then also, like, is it continuing? Is there like a new Sahil there that's like a new software engineer, or is it just like now it's like stalled that you've left?
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, I think it is kind of like, unless once you leave, there's no one really there picking up the work. Like the amount of sort of constraints on DOGE are just like, it's a lot to be. You got to move to DC. You got to, it's a very uncertain role. A lot of people don't really like you if you do it. Like there's like a lot of stigma associated with it. So I think that the team was like a lot smaller than I was expecting. I think there are certain projects that will do really well. Like I think Joe Gebbia is working on like the OPM digitized retirement stuff. I think that will continue. That was a project that was happening pre-DOGE, and so they just kind of like massively accelerated it. GSA is working on like centralized procurement. I think that will do really well over time. But I think at VA, it's just huge. It's like a cruise ship, it's just like this massive thing. They should, and what I recommended was to hire software engineers. Like I'm like, the number one most important thing I could do would be like recruit and filter your software engineers. And like, actually, if you have 10 people who can code, then I don't need to be in these meetings, and then you would save a lot of money. I think I ended up, the DOGE number on VA is about $1.6 billion in contracts that were cut. But most of them were cut actually even before I got there. All the low hanging fruit. In terms of the contracts, I was able to cut maybe like $10 or $20 million a year worth of contracts, which is still impressive because it's like I had to burden that work and do it myself or whatever. But it's it's like more than the revenues of Gumroad, but but it's not. I like doubled my impact on the world or whatever. But it is this like one and done thing, and now you're seeing with the big beautiful bill that like, to be honest, like DOGE is like a really nice marketing thing, but it's kind of a scapegoat for Trump, I think, to a degree, and I think Congress doesn't really care. Like, and I think frankly, the average American, like, they like the idea of like saving money and making the government more efficient and better and hiring software engineers and modernizing, but if it comes at the behest of like other things they really care about, it like no like the debt, for example, like it doesn't seem to me that like people care that deeply about it. Unlike Elon, who seems to really care about that. So yeah, I think I hope, and I've heard that DOGE will spend a lot more time like on this sort of the shipping software piece after the easy wins are done. You're kind of like a private equity buyout. You like cut costs first, and then you start to rebuild and build new stuff. I just worry that at the end of the day, DOGE is not really in charge. Who's in charge is Trump, and I don't know his appetite for actually being like, hey, we should have an app in which you could pay your taxes. I don't know if that's the kind of thing that either party is that excited about. It sort of ends up becoming more of an ideological battle, and the careers are the ones who actually care, right? They're the ones who actually work at the VA, who actually care about veterans. And so that's kind of why when I joined, I was like, I just wanted to hang out with the career employees and like help them become more competent. I got Cursor, I got V0, I got Devin. I just gave them a bunch of AI tools. I like would do demos for people in the engineering org and just be like, hey, by the way, this is how fast you can move if you're willing to use V0 and some of these AI tools. You can prototype stuff, you can, and I think that's where most of my impact was, which is unquantifiable, right? It's hard to say like what's the value of sort of upskilling a bunch of VA people on AI. But I'm hopeful that impact is quite massive over time.
There's something to be said about this idea of like private, company leaders and like, talent going into government for a while and having an impact. I think that's something that could be really valuable if it was structured correctly and if we had a system for doing this. So like, I think this is not a bad idea for like, anyone in private industry. Could be, Imad or me, or even going to the government for 60, 90 days and doing something and then having some sort of tail to that. Like maybe once, you come in for 1 day a month after that, right? Just to see how your initiative is going.
But I do agree with Sahil. There can't be with this like aggressive, like, you guys screwed up. Like we're coming in to like fix your problems. Like it has to be much more of a cooperative stance.
Yeah, it has to be cooperative for sure.
yeah.
And there needs to be buy-in from the president, so.
Yeah, you need, and I think the credit that Trump and Elon and everybody else deserve a lot is that they got us in the room. I think like like I heard from people that like Biden, obviously like generally the average tech person is probably leans left, but just like when you actually go to DC, there's like just zero interest in like having software engineers like build software. Like it was very policy heavy, right? Or administration generally is. So I think that was really impressive that Elon and convinced Trump that like, no, we need actual people who build software in these meetings, in these agencies. And I think that but yeah, I think it's sort of like because it became so ideological, it just alienates most people. Like the smartest people aren't willing to like pick a side, right? Like you just want to make things better. And I tried to be as apolitical about it as possible, and effectively it meant that I wasn't like a good fit culturally for DOGE eventually. Like it just didn't work, because I think that's what at the end of the day, that's like the job they were really signed up to do, was to kind of just like hatchet the federal government to a degree that most people would not be willing to do. And you could even agree with a lot of it, but just like the political flack is just too great. But yeah, if there was a system, if there was like a really great way for like all of these amazing tech founders to spend a day a week or, 2 hours via Zoom, like it doesn't even have to be moving to DC, right? It could just be like every agency should have access to private industry experience in a way that, I think what they would probably tell you is like, oh, it's, corruption and like you're going to like self deal and like all the, like the flack would be a lot. But I think my solution to that is like, what I told VA, what I told DOGE is like, why don't we just live stream the meetings? Like, why do these meetings even have to be private, right? Like, if like Patrick Collison is like helping the Treasury think through a problem, it's not like what's national security risk about, like why not just put that on the internet?
And that's a great idea.
And I think over time that's what will happen. The government is actually required OMB has this rule where like 20% of the code the government pays for has to be open source.
Oh, really?
So there's a lot of open, yeah. So it's slowly happening, and I think that like there'll be a DOGE, USDS like 3.0, 4.0. Like this is like a, it's kind of a startup within the federal government, and it's kind of, this was like the Series B or something like that, right? And like hopefully it had like 40, 50, 60 people, and hopefully it doesn't get nixed by the next administration. It continues to like thrive, and over time like
They'll just keep
grow.
changing its name.
Exactly, yeah.
It's
Like
like
that's
Doge,
the that's
digital.
like the it'll always be USDS, but they'll always come up with like some new acronym for it. The government loves acronyms. Like I think that's like the best thing. It's kind of like in the startup too. Like
Every big
the
company
naming.
does. Every big company.
Yeah,
does
exactly.
acronyms.
Naming is so fun, right? Like it feels like you
Yeah.
have a real stamp on the world when you get to name something.
I worked at ExxonMobil for an internship, and they love acronyms.
Well, AI can also suggest names.
I want to touch on one thing, Sahil. Like, so you've been through this journey where you raised money from Kleiner, right? Series A, and and then you got off the venture track. So this is a very interesting thing where you've gone from like venture to non-venture, which is normally very difficult, right? Like because the venture capitalists expect something. Normally, companies just die when they just go from like venture to non-venture, and the founders start a new company. How did you manage that transition? I guess Gumroad probably didn't have the escape velocity to raise another round or something. But maybe tell us how that, because I remember that round was quite hyped at the time. I think Mike Abbott was the partner, and he was also, a hotshot new VC, right?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, it was a hot. I mean, I remember back in the day, $7 million Series A was like massive.
Yeah.
Now
Yep.
it's a little bit different.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, basically, we failed to raise our Series B, so we really wanted to. It was not my plan to get off the venture track. It was like, no, stay on this thing and like reach escape velocity.
Why can you raise it? You weren't growing fast enough, or
Basically, yeah, we were growing. I think that year we grew like 60 or 80% year over year. And Thrive, I think, had just put money into Patreon at a really high valuation, and Patreon was growing like much faster than we were. Had recurring revenue, by definition. And I think we were always doing good, but never great. We had like a great product, great brand, great team, great investors. Like, but we never like. I think the
good
market
but not great is like the real VC trap. Like if it's great
Very
or bad,
painful.
that's easy, but good is really difficult.
Yeah, exactly. I think we were doing good, and that's just not good enough, right?
I guess normally in that situation, VCs would push you to go sell it, right? So like, yeah, how did it come
Yeah.
that like you actually like got them to like basically like sell the stake, right? Like, what was the situation?
I mean, basically, I was like, I don't want to sell the business. Like, I really, I had a lot of faith in it. Maybe I was just stubborn. Maybe it was just too hard to do it. But I just really didn't want to go down that path, especially in like a forced sale. Like at some point, like strategically, maybe it makes sense. But like to just do it, to generate like 30 cents on the dollar or whatever, like it just didn't feel like a great outcome. Like, especially if it led to the product eventually getting killed by the acquirer. And we did talk. We talked to Patreon, Kickstarter, Stripe, Square, like those kinds of companies. Medium, I think. They offer like some amount, but it was like an acquire more than it was like a product acquisition. So I was like, this doesn't make sense. Like I'd rather just like let almost everybody go and just like run it profitably and see what happens. And the product is still growing 60-80%. So like maybe eventually it'll be something interesting. COVID happened. That was like a big moment for us. So like some of that panned out, but basically I was like, I'm just, and Mike, to his credit, was like, dude, like just do what you want to do. Like, I'm not going to pressure you to like force yourself to sell or force yourself to shut down or whatnot. Like there's some opportunity cost here, like you only have a certain amount of time to like do this kind of thing. But if this is what you want to do, then fine. And then he eventually, I think a year or two later, he ended up leaving Kleiner. So he left Kleiner. He kind of vacated the board seat. So we had like no board really there. And then I would do these kind of like, every year or something, I would have like a call with Kleiner where they kind of like, how's it going? What's the P&L look like? Like we need to update our books sort of thing. And then I asked them, I think as part of one of the calls, like, would you sell? Like, and they're like, no, it's like not really. How do you negotiate that? It's kind of tough. And then in 2017, I think December of 2017, they emailed me and they're like, "Hey, we'd be interested to sell our stake back to you for $1." And that was kind of like the entire email thread. It was like, I was like,
You were like, where do I send the check?
I know. I was like, are you for real? Like, what's the catch? What's the, where does the string go to? And they're like, no catch. They didn't give me a reason why. I assume it's like a tax write-off thing or whatever.
Yeah, tax write-off must be.
There's
but they
actually
never really.
two or three reasons. Number one, a fund has a life of 10 years. So you really do have to vacate almost all your portfolio in like 10 years. Sometimes people now stretch it to 12, 13 years, but it's really problematic having like things that sit around because your LPs definitely do not want to stake in Gumroad as a private company. That will be a pain in the ass. That's one thing. Number two, they have to keep auditing you. So you were probably costing them like 5K plus every year. Maybe not that much, but something like that. And then obviously, I guess I had a third reason, but those two are probably like the biggest reason.
Well, tax write-off.
Yeah, and then you get a tax
Oh yeah,
write-off,
the tax
like
write-off.
$7
Yeah,
million tax write-off or whatnot, right? So they probably had a good year with Slack or Uber or who knows what.
Yep.
And so they did that.
And it was
so
in
that's
December,
really,
right? So it was right at the end of the year. So like tax.
It was at December. Yeah, it was.
Yeah,
it was
yeah.
December.
No, that's
so
funny. Yeah.
that makes sense. They're like, we got to get it done $1. At that point, it doesn't matter if they make $1 back or $100 back or whatever.
Yeah, absolutely.
So yeah, they did. I bought a few other people out sort of at that same juncture, but we still have some of the early investors. Sorry,
for $1? Did you buy everyone else for $1?
No, no one else was willing to do $1. I think Chris Songa did $100. But yeah, I mean, I think like we bought Mark Cuban back. Like we did get rid of sort of a lot of the early investors, cashed them out. But we still have, even today, we still have from the seed round, we still have Excel, we still have Max Levchin, and we still have First Round. So those three are still on the cap table.
Did they respond to your emails?
They still respond to my emails. They get dividends every year. They get to participate in the buyback that we do every year as well. So we just actually finished this one buyback, and Excel sold like 97% of their seed round. They still have like their pro rata in the A that they're holding on to. And they made, I think they made about 6x on this.
Well,
it took 14 years for a 6x. So, but they it's kind of cool to say that we generated.
At what point were you like, hey, let's just do dividends versus kind of, I guess, like the normal, startup route is to keep reinvesting, right? But it was just like making money, and you were like, I don't see why I shouldn't pay myself. Is that kind of the reasoning?
Yeah, basically. I mean, even when I said that, like I told like Excel that, and they're like, why don't you just pay yourself like more money? Like, why just pay yourself like a salary of, But well, I had raised this crowdfunding round, so I felt like in March of 2021 we raised $5 million from 7,000 people. I know Mercury's done something similar, and I just felt like if I was just paying myself a higher salary, like I was kind of like screwing over these people in some sense. Like I'm just like dividending only me, and so. Why not? And I just looked at like
salary
what
is a higher tax, right? Or is the tax more
correct.
on a dividend? Yeah. So why would you not do a dividend if you're a big owner?
Yeah, and the reason not to is just like it's kind of annoying. Like it's like you have to figure out how to do it, And so we ended up building like a piece of software to help with this process. We're actually gonna like spin out the equity dividend stuff and launch hopefully later this year like a product that exclusively does distributions for companies.
Oh, that's cool.
Well, that's what Flexile is, right?
Yeah, so Flexile is kind of like contractor payments as well as dividends. It's kind of this weird mix because we needed both. So we're gonna basically take the dividends and it's gonna be called DIYPO.com. Basically like run a public company but not be public, which is effectively doing dividends, and tender offers. Like those are kind of like the two features. There's also a return of capital, I guess, every once in a while if you're just shutting down and you want to return money back. But generally those two, if basically you buy investors and you sell to investors, and like you just have this like yearly cadence or quarterly cadence of doing that. And then the way we do the buyback is it's an auction, so it kind of has a clearing price based on the investors who want to sell. And so people who bought in really early, at 60 cents on the dollar are now selling at $4 on the dollar, and valuing Gumroad at like 40 or $50 million or something like that. And over time that number will go up, and that's kind of how we do a dividend, 60% of net income. which I just came from like reading a book, and Warren Buffett like was quoted or something as saying like, this is a reasonable number, and this is what profitable companies do, and that's kind of like how I'm trying to operate. I'm just trying to operate as if I were a public profitable company, without the scale of it. And the nice thing with software is you don't need, software you don't have to hire like a bunch of accountants or like pay some crazy public company service to $500,000 a year to like process your dividends.
This is fascinating stuff. I mean, I think this is a really interesting path for a lot of, many founders only know of the success stories because that's what they're fed all the time, on the VC track. But they don't know about this other path, especially in tech companies. So I think definitely I'm looking forward to all this stuff being open sourced. I know we're running out of time here, but I did have one last question for you, Sahil, which is like, you're radically transparent about your business, right? Like it's like you are operating a public company. Do you recommend that path for other founders? Like even if they're operating privately, especially if they're going on the path that you are, which is a profitable company, like how has the transparency helped you? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's helped in a lot of ways, there's maybe some downsides too we can talk about, but like the upside is like, one, it's like empathetic, like it's marketing, right? I mean, it's a way of building a brand. It's a way of like getting people to care about you and your company. There are many Gumroad creators who've made lots of money on Gumroad who've told me explicitly, like the reason they used Gumroad was because they wanted to support this kind of thing, especially around COVID, that we were super transparent about like the money creators would make. We do these public board meetings. I just think, it's not necessarily about like the pros and cons. It's just like, what is the right thing to do? And like, I just think, I don't know. I just think transparency is great. Like, it's hard for me to see a real downside to the world about like too much transparency, Like, I think it's hard to argue that like less code should be open source, for example. And so it just felt like the right thing to do. And especially because Gumroad, like, I don't necessarily recommend it to like Cursor or Mercury or like, like there are risks. There's security audits you have to go through. There's potential attack vectors that will open up. There may be clones and other copycats, and like, even if there's nothing wrong necessarily with that, like it diffuses your customer base. Like, there are real risks to it. Mostly it's just time consuming, frankly. I don't think it's like people are against this. It's like, if you have limited engineers, do you want to spend time building features for your customers, or do you want to go open source, right? So I think we were just kind of running out of things to do. We like had built like the sort of the things that Gumroad creators mostly want, and so we just decided to invest in this kind of thing. I also felt just disconnected socially from Silicon Valley. Like, I've always enjoyed the culture and enjoyed talking to people, and it's like the smartest people on earth working on really interesting problems, and I think that will kind of always be true. And it was a way of like having something to say, like in that conversation, and like participating socially, the sort of build in public sort of mentality. And I think now I believe that like, as we were talking about before, like being a junior engineer in this market is kind of tough. And I think it's open source, and I think publicizing a lot of this stuff, it allows people to learn, like the videos don't, it's not like they get hundreds of thousands of views or like millions of people are interested in how Gumroad, operates. But my guess is that there's like dozens of people who have learned a lot from those videos, and have like been like, oh, even like, like unicorn, whatever, like public, not public companies, but companies that we would all recognize and name. They'd be like, oh, I watched your board meeting video, and like we took something away from that, and you actually run a really good one. And I'm like, yeah, it's because like if you run one and there's like 4 people, you're like gonna like kind of phone it in. Like, it doesn't really matter that much, You're going to use like whatever black text on white background, that sort of thing. But if you're going to put this on YouTube, it's kind of like a piece of content. You're going to invest more in like fact checking all the numbers and like making sure there are no errors, and like, so that's another reason I think I do it, frankly, is I think it just makes me better. Like, I think it's just like why I open source the DOGE code, why I open source all the Gumroad code. I just think your work, you just will do a better job because that people may look at your, it's like, you have guests over, you're going to clean the house, right? Like, it's kind of like having guests over all the time.
All right, Sahil, you're a super interesting person, so I feel like we could go on for another hour. There's so much other stuff we could have talked about, including
we'll do a part 2.
You have a book now as well, so we got to get you on the podcast again. But people should look you up on X, where you always create some interesting content. But really appreciate having you on, Sahil. Good catching up.
Yeah, likewise. Thanks for having me. It was great.
Thanks everyone for listening. Please leave us a review on whatever channel you're listening on. Makes a big difference to the algorithm and to the success of the show. And see you all next week.